So as always, just a couple housekeeping notes before we begin today. So our webinar will be recorded and we'll later share it on our YouTube channel, where you'll also find recordings of all past Watershed Wednesday webinars. So there's a QR code on my screen here. If you follow that, it will link you to the registration for any upcoming webinars that we'll have going on in the fall. And also you can find our YouTube channel there with all of our series of previous webinars recorded. I would like to ask you to keep your microphone muted and your video off during the presentation today, just to preserve the bandwidth and to try to ensure the best possible video quality. And as per usual, we'll have a Q&A period during the last 10 or so minutes of the webinar. So I'll ask you to please use the chat feature to post your questions there, and feel free to post any questions that come up during the presentation, and I'll just read them out in order. So before we get into the presentation today, I would like to start off our webinar in a good way. In the spirit of respect and reciprocity, NSWA acknowledges that the lands within the watershed of the North Saskatchewan River are in Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and the Métis homeland. These lands are the traditional territories, traveling routes, and gathering places of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Stoney, and Nakota Sioux. We recognize and thank the Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands since time immemorial and whose rich histories, cultures, languages, and presence continue to enrich these sacred lands that we all steward today as treaty people. We invite all of you participants to learn about the pathway towards reconciliation presented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 90 calls to action. There is a QR code on the screen there that will link you to access that document. And we also invite you to learn about the Indigenous peoples whose lands on which you reside, and to reflect on your place within the watershed. So if you like, please feel free to share in the chat where you're dialing in from today, whether that's a treaty territory, watershed, a different province, or even another country. So as I mentioned, we're joined today by NSWA's own Ellen Shain. Ellen has been with NSWA since 2014 and currently leads the organization's key strategic projects. Alongside leading the Riparian Health Action Plan and the Riparian Web Portal, she is paving NSWA's embarkment into natural asset management, drought resilience, and now the North Saskatchewan River Basin Roadmap. Ellen holds a Master's of Science in Integrated Water Resource Management from McGill University. So with that, I will pass it over to Ellen for the presentation.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm just gonna share my screen here. And you can see my presentation screen?
Yes, looks great.
Great, thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to present on this project today. I'm happy to be sharing the project results on behalf of the full team, which is made up of NSWA, Water Smart Solutions, and Mac Hydro, along with contributions from many stakeholders from across the basin. So just a presentation overview. I'll start by walking us through a bit of the background on the project, how we kicked it off, along with a Watershed 101 overview to set the stage. And from there, I'll share some highlights from the modeling work that we did to help us understand water availability and how it might change in the future. And all along the way, I'll discuss roadmap strategies that emerged from the project. So as many of you know, the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, or NSWA, is a charitable organization and one of 11 watershed planning and advisory councils in Alberta. All the WPACs operate under the Provincial Water for Life strategy, which focuses on three main goals: safe and secure drinking water, healthy aquatic ecosystems, and a reliable quality water supply for sustainable economy. And at the NSWA, we work with partners across our watershed to advance these goals through collaborative projects and research. And the project we're discussing today really focuses primarily on this third goal, understanding and maintaining a reliable water supply. But it also really connects to the other two goals because availability ultimately affects both drinking water security and the health of aquatic ecosystems. So for decades, communities in the North Saskatchewan River Basin have really benefited from a relatively abundant water supply compared to other regions of the province and compared to the demands that we had here. But that picture is beginning to change. On the supply side, we're seeing shifts across our basin. Climate change is increasing variability in precipitation and runoff, and the glaciers that feed our water supply are expected to disappear within the century. At the same time, water demand is growing. The population of the Edmonton region, is expected to grow significantly in the coming decades, and the industrial heartland continues to expand with new developments that require substantial water inputs. Taken together, these trends raise important questions about the future of water security in the basin. And personally, when I speak with municipalities across the basin, I'm often asked the same kinds of questions that you see on the screen. Is there enough water for the environment and people? Do we have enough water for both population and economic growth? What happens when our glaciers melt? What does the future look like for our tributaries? And for a long time, the honest answer was we don't really know. And that uncertainty was the main impetus for this project. The better we can understand these risks, and the better we are positioned to plan ahead, prepare for change, and prevent future water shortages. Doing so protects our communities and also gives investors greater confidence in the long-term resilience of our water supply. So to address these questions, the NSWA hired WaterSmart Solutions, who had previously completed a similar project in the South Sask River Basin. Our project began in early 2024, and over the next year and a half brought together major water users from across the basin to develop a roadmap that helps us collectively improve the long-term sustainability and reliability of our water resource. So how we did that, we, as I mentioned, brought together a working group. We developed a model of how the basin currently functions. We used that model to explore some future scenarios, and then we worked as a team to develop a set of strategies to strengthen water security. And those strategies serve as the roadmap. So just a little snapshot here of the working group. It was made up of major water users from across the basins. Participants included representatives from industry, municipalities, power generation, several provincial government departments, NGOs, academia, agricultural producers, and Indigenous organizations. While the group certainly didn't represent every perspective in the basin, it did bring together a broad range of major and potential water users. In total, about 50 organizations were invited to participate, and roughly 30 groups were regularly involved throughout the project. The project it launched in April of 2024 and ran for about 16 months. And during that time, participants learned more about the watershed. They discussed their values and identified performance measures and scenarios they felt were the most important to explore in the model. The project operated within several important policy and regulatory frameworks. These included alignment with Alberta's the Alberta Water Act, and the NSWA's Integrated Watershed Management Plan. Working within these existing frameworks helped us to ensure that the strategies developed throughout the project are relevant and practical within our current water system. And this infographic is just a snapshot of some of the key water management strategies that came out of the roadmap. Each of these strategies is supported by a set of recommended actions, along with more detailed guidance about how those actions could be implemented in practice. So I'll be referring to these strategies throughout the project. I know that they look really small here, but I'll be referring to them throughout the presentation. And of course, you can go to our website and download the whole report to find everything in detail. One important piece of feedback that we heard from the Indigenous participants on the working group was that the project was very technical and quantitative in nature. And while modeling is useful, it doesn't capture the full range of relationships that people have with water, including cultural connections, lived experiences, and the deep importance of access to clean water. So to help honor and capture these perspectives, the project team co-funded a parallel initiative called Lived Experiences of the Watershed. And through this project, people from across the watershed were interviewed about their connections to the river and the role that water plays in their communities and livelihoods. And these interviews were conducted with individuals from 8 First Nations, Métis representatives, and people working in land-based sectors where they're really connected to water, so forestry and agriculture. Their stories were not something that we could fit into a technical model, but they did help us to shape some of the strategies in the roadmap. And the perspectives offered are available as we move forward on all the recommended strategies. One of the benefits of doing this project was the knowledge sharing between working groups, which helped all of us have a better understanding of how the watershed functions. So there's like a collective improvement in knowing how the whole watershed functions when we all put our heads together. And so I'd like to take a few minutes now to walk through some of those like key features of the watershed, I think that they serve as an important foundation for understanding the modeling results. So let's begin by following the journey of a drop of water through the North Saskatchewan River watershed, shown as the colored section up in the top left. It begins high in the Rocky Mountains at the Saskatchewan Glacier, where snow and ice melt slowly into small headwater rivers. As the rivers flow downstream, its size increases. It's joined by more creeks, some of which originate, many of which originate in forested areas and support cold water fish species. Further downstream, the river encounters Abraham Lake, which is actually a reservoir stored behind a large dam. For a short time, the river settles here until it is released again downstream. From there, it continues east, moving through the foothills and past growing communities like Rocky Mountain House and Drayton Valley. And at this point, the river has nearly grown to its full size, carrying with it the vast majority of the basin's water supply. As it flows further downstream, the river begins to support more people and more activity, supplying water to cities, agriculture, and industry, including the Edmonton region and the industrial heartland. Along the way, water is taken out, it's used, it's treated, and it's returned, continuing its journey downstream. By the time it reaches the Saskatchewan border, that single drop of water has been shaped by everything upstream, by landscapes, communities, climate, and infrastructure across 57,000 square kilometers. But the journey doesn't stop there. The river continues east into Saskatchewan, past communities like North Battleford, merging with the South Saskatchewan River, and eventually reaching Lake Winnipeg. And from there, it flows north to the Hudson Bay. Yeah, so it flows north to the Hudson Bay. So when we talk about water in this basin, we're not just talking about the local river in Alberta. We're also talking about an interconnected system that links ecosystems, communities, provinces, traveling routes, and histories across a vast landscape. Water is needed by everyone for many different purposes. Communities need water for drinking purposes. Farmers need water to grow our food, and industry uses water to produce energy, oil, and gas products that we use. The river itself also needs water to support the fish and aquatic ecosystems that live in and near the river. And this is also tied to Indigenous rights, including fishing and harvesting. And we also have some downstream neighbors who are looking to us for the water that we're sending across the border. Under interprovincial agreements, Alberta must ensure that at least 50% of the river flows continue into Saskatchewan. So water management in this basin is really about balancing multiple needs across communities, ecosystems, and jurisdictions. One big challenge that we have in our basin is that we don't really fully know how much water is needed to sustain a healthy river system. This is typically determined through something called an in-stream flow needs assessment. However, this type of assessment hasn't yet been completed for the river. So this creates a little bit of uncertainty when trying to balance human needs with ecological needs and highlights a critical gap in our understanding. And this is something that I'll revisit later in the presentation. So what makes it so complex to meet all of these needs? There's two key factors that drive water availability: location and timing of both supply and demand. From a timing perspective, most of our water supplies arrive during a short window in late spring and early summer, driven by snowmelt and rainfall. This also implies that we have some dry seasons. But demand, especially for municipal and industrial use, remains relatively steady across the year, even during our driest seasons. From a location perspective, not all of our water users are able to draw from the ample supplies of the main stem. If they're located a bit further away, they have to rely on what's available nearby, often small creeks that carry less reliable water supply. You might be surprised to learn that there are some vast networks of pipes that send water from the Edmonton region to well over 80 communities across the basin. Still, some of these communities and still some communities and farmers rely on local tributaries. So even in a province that might appear to be water rich, mismatches in location and timing of supply and demand can create real challenges. So we're going to take a closer look at water supply now. Water in this basin mainly comes from four sources: snowmelt, rainfall, glacial melt, and groundwater storage. You can kind of see um, how they're represented in these graphs, with glacier melt being this kind of like turquoise blue at the top, the snow melt being the lighter blue, and then rain darker blue color. Most of the river's water is generated in the headwaters, where precipitation is the highest and where temperatures are the lowest. And as we move east across the watershed, conditions become warmer and drier, and evaporation increases. So put these two things together, and this reduces how much water actually makes it into the streams and rivers in our eastern end of the watershed. So this is what this map here is showing. Most of the water in our basin is produced in these darker colored areas, and less so in these more eastern areas. So this sort of explains why the vast majority of flow in the North Saskatchewan River is already in the river by the time it passes Drayton Valley, about 90% of its total volume. Downstream, tributaries are much smaller, but they don't add much flow to the main stem, but they do play an important role affecting water quality, often contributing nutrients, sediments, and organics from the developed landscape. Looking at these hydrographs here, which are basically graphs that show how water flows are distributed over a calendar year. In the headwaters, water supply is highly concentrated in the summer months, as you can see here, and very low, very low flows in much of the rest of the year. Further downstream, the picture looks kind of similar. We have those peaks in the summer, and we have lower winter flows, but the picture is a bit more moderated. Changes to water supply are driven by a few different factors. First is climate variability and climate change. The amount of precipitation that we get from year to year, it shifts, oscillating between those El Nino and La Nina years, which is really quite normal, and results in a pretty wide range of precipitation from year to year, which you can kind of see represented in this graph here between the dark blue and the yellow. There's a range of what we consider normal. Climate change models are showing that we could get more precipitation in the basin, though we should expect more unpredictability with storms and droughts. Unpredictability is actually quite common for this part of the country. In an interesting study conducted by Dr. David Sachin using tree ring data, he showed us that over the past 800 plus years, this basin has experienced multi-decadal droughts, some far more severe than anything we've ever seen since settlers arrived in this area. If you'd like to learn more about this study, we hosted Dr. Sachin in a previous episode of the Watershed Wednesday, and we can drop that link in the chat. Other important drivers of water supply changes include glacial loss, loss of natural storage features like wetlands and forests, which normally help to absorb and slowly release water. Wildfire, which can reduce infiltration and increase runoff and flooding. And dam operations, which influence when and how water is available downstream. So together, these factors not only affect how much water we have, but also when and where it's available. And I'm going to kind of dive into each one of these in a little bit more detail. So taking a closer look at dam operations, there are two main key dams in the headwaters. We have the Bighorn Dam and the Brazeau Dam. And these dams were built in the 1970s for hydroelectric generation, and they store water during high flow periods and release it throughout the rest of the year. This has changed it has significantly changed the river's natural flow patterns, which you can kind of see up here on this graph. The dark blue being kind of before the dams, and the lighter pink being after the dams. So historically, shown again in that blue color, Flows were very, very high in the summer and much lower in the winter. And today, summer peaks have been reduced and winter flows are much higher and more stable. So this benefits communities and industries that rely on year-round water access and helps to dilute their effluent, resulting in improved water quality. But it also means that water availability is closely tied to how these dams are operated, and they can change on even an hourly basis based to meet power demands. Another important piece of the system is glacial melt. Projections show that we're going to likely lose most, if not all, of these glaciers by the end of the century. And the question is, what will that do to our water supply? The impact will most heavily be felt in Headwaters creeks, where glacial melt represents a larger proportion of their flows, as you can see up here. However, by the time that by the time that water reaches Edmonton, it's been mixed with an influx of rain and snowmelt volumes that kind of overshadow the glacial contribution. Glaciers contribute relatively small portions of the total annual flow, roughly between 2 to 3% near Edmonton. This proportion can grow to a higher amount during dry years when other sources of moisture are limited. So losing glaciers really kind of means that we're losing a natural buffer in the system and highlights the need to be able to prepare for that reality. So turning over to water demand. Currently, water allocations in the basin represent about 18% of our average annual flows, and this is spread across roughly 6,300 licenses. These licenses are issued by the government of Alberta using the first in time, first in right system. And this means that senior license holders are prioritized to receive their full allocation first, while junior license holders rely on whatever water remains. In large river basins in other parts of Alberta, an approved water management plan is in place to formally guide the allocation, use, and conservation of water in this basin. But a plan has not yet been developed for the NSR. Existing licenses support a range of uses, including municipal, industrial, agricultural, and commercial needs. Notably, industry is the largest water user in our basin, which is actually kind of different than the broader provincial picture where agriculture is the largest user. It's also important to keep a few key points in mind because this will come up in the modeling results. First is that not all allocated water is actually used. So people can have a larger allocation of water than what they actually use. And then the other flip of the coin is that much of the water that is used is treated and returned to the river. So as a result, only about 4% of the annual flow is truly consumed in this basin, meaning that it is not returned to the system for other users. And finally, while some uses like agriculture are seasonal, most of the demand in this basin is relatively consistent year-round, which doesn't always align with when water is most available. So now that we've grounded ourselves in how the watershed works, we're going to shift back towards the project to begin answering some of those questions that we asked earlier. And I'll walk you through a few different scenarios that we tested and what the model tells us, and then how those insights informed the strategies in the roadmap. Just to get us on a good foot, we want to take a moment to demystify what a hydrologic model actually is. So at its core, it's a digital simulation of how the river system behaves. It helps us understand where water comes into the system, when, how it moves across the landscape, and when it's available throughout the year. So it also accounts for things like reservoir storage and dam releases. And then on top of that, we can layer in human activity. So where and when water is being withdrawn and then used and then treated and then returned back to the river. This particular model that was used in this project was run on a daily time step using the Raven platform. And it was run by Mac Hydro, the hydrology team at Mac Hydro. The data was calibrated using actual data from the basin, from monitoring stations like those that are regularly monitored by the Water Survey of Canada, as well as the Sasquatch monitoring program. These results are based on the best available data and assumptions, but they're still just predictions. There's a saying in modeling that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So rather than focusing on the exact numbers that we're about to talk about, we really want to pay attention to the trends and patterns and the relative magnitude of change. So how did we use the model? We used it to test a range of what-if scenarios. We adjusted different factors in the system, including those that fall into the categories of land cover, climate, and water management changes. For land use changes, we evaluated disturbance scenarios like a large-scale forest fire in the basin and how that might actually impact runoff. For climate conditions, we explored potential future wet and dry scenarios to understand how variability and extremes could affect the system. And for water management, we looked at current water use, which we will be calling our baseline. We looked at growth in water allocations and increased use of the existing allocations. We looked at an introduction of environmental flow targets. We looked at changing reservoir operations, such as an earlier refill or increased storage capacity, as well as adding new off-stream storage at different parts in the river. So we then combined these in different ways to see how the system might respond under multiple overlapping pressures. So to evaluate these scenarios, we needed a way to measure the impact. So working with the stakeholders in the working group, we identified a set of performance measures based on what they felt mattered most in the basin. So these included apportionment, which asks the question, are we meeting our obligations to send at least 50% of the flows into Saskatchewan? Assimilative capacity, which asks the question, is there enough water in the river to properly dilute treated wastewater? When this capacity is reduced, it actually affects water quality and could potentially affect aquatic ecosystem health. The next is potential water shortages. So are there times when water demand anywhere in the basin can't be fully met? So water shortages, we have to think about this not as something that is, we're told to turn off our municipal water taps or anything. It's shortages that are really experienced by junior license holders first, who may face restrictions during those low flow periods. And generally, municipal supplies are typically protected due to the fact that they're senior license holders. Moving on to water temperature, specifically the number of days exceeding 18 degrees Celsius, which can stress aquatic ecosystems. Peak flows near Edmonton, so this is kind of like near flood or flood-like conditions. Tributary low flows, the percentage of summer days where water levels fall below normal. And we did look at specifically at, generally at tributaries, but then specifically at Vermilion. So I'll indicate when we switch between them. These tributary conditions are especially important because they can impact agricultural users and livestock operations and also local ecosystem health. So to sum it all up, the approach that we used is we ran a scenario, we measured the impact, and then we explored strategies to respond. So the first scenario that we looked at was increased water demand. We tested 3 variations of water demand. Baseline scenario, which represents current conditions about those 6,300 licenses, some of which are not fully used. So the next one is a growth scenario. So what happens if we add new licenses while maintaining the current proportion that is unused? Specifically, we really focused on those biggest water users. So what happens if water demand from industrial users doubles? And then as well as some growth with municipal demand as well. And then finally, we have the full allocation scenario, which keeps the same number of licenses as what we had originally or currently have. And but it just sort of it assumes that the users now withdraw their full allocated amount. And we ran those scenarios and we tested to see what would happen to the performance indicators. So on the top row, you'll see the three different scenarios. And on the left column here, we have the performance measures. And these green check marks here, they indicate that we're meeting apportionment. And these arrows, these orange arrows here, that kind of indicate where we see some larger spikes in those performance measures. So looking at assimilative capacity, we can see how the number of days where we might experience some issues with, I guess, assimilating or diluted wastewater, they grow in these two other scenarios, especially in the full allocation scenario, doubling basically from 37 to 65 days under the full allocation scenario. For potential water shortages, we see a dramatic increase in the full allocation scenario as well, suddenly spiking up to over just under 1,500 cubic dams per year. And furthermore, the tributaries could suffer as well. We see a dramatic increase in the number of days of where we could experience low flow conditions. And again, I just want to remind folks that this isn't really about the specific numbers, but rather it's kind of, we want to really focus on those trends where we see like doubling happening, what they call magnitude and direction of the trend changes. So what do these impacts actually mean and who's affected? Reduced assimilative capacity can affect aquatic ecosystems and downstream users who rely on good water quality. Water shortages, they primarily affect junior water license holders first. And then the last being those low flows in tributaries. And those can really impact agricultural producers as well as local ecosystems. So overall, the results of the scenario tell us a few important things. Increased water demand has a disproportionate impact on tributaries. Water shortages increase only slightly between the baseline and growth scenario, but they rise much more sharply under a full allocation scenario. And in the growth scenario, demand is concentrated in the Edmonton-Pecan corridor. But under the full allocation, we see a much broader declines across multiple indicators, including potential water shortages, assimilative capacity, and tributary low flows. So the working group co-designed a set of strategies in response to these observations in the model. For issues that related to increased water demand, the following roadmap strategies were devised. So the first is that we will work with the GOA to establish an approved water management plan. As a reminder, an approved water management plan is a formal planning instrument that provides science-based direction for the allocation, decisions, use, and conservation of water within a defined basin. It is the policy tool that prevents the basin from becoming overallocated. The next is to improve water security for Indigenous communities, ensuring adequate and safe water is available for drinking, for household use, community needs, and emergency services. This strategy reflects a strong priority from the working group to ensure reliable and safe water access for Indigenous communities, not just for today, but for future conditions as well. The next is to establish a basin scale conservation, efficiency, and productivity targets for municipalities, industry, and agriculture to incentivize sustainable water use. So those are CEP targets. CEP targets are about using water more efficiently, so getting more value from the water we already have across all sectors. The next is to support the development and implementation of water reuse projects in collaboration with industry and municipalities. So water reuse is a pretty big opportunity, especially in industrial systems where water can be treated and reused multiple times, reducing overall demand. And finally, the last point here is to improve access to and use of alternative water sources for consumptive operations, including improved data availability. So alternative water sources could include things like non-potable sources, recycled water, or improved data to help identify new opportunities. Um, and again, I just want to say that each of these strategies is supported by a more detailed action plan in the roadmap, which outlines how they could be implemented in practice. Okay, so the next scenario we're going to explore is climate change and how shifting temperatures and precipitation patterns could impact the river system. So to do this, the hydrologists from MacHydro, they drew from 14 regional climate projections, and these projections were developed by the government of Alberta. From those, we selected two scenarios to kind of test the outer edges of risk. So they aren't the most likely climate change scenario futures, but they are within a range of what is possible. In the dry future scenario, this represents it comes from a lower emission future. It had the driest overall conditions, and so that was the one that was used. And with the wet scenario, it actually also comes from a lower emission future, but with the highest projected precipitation of all the scenarios that were evaluated. Um, so you'll see for each of those, for those that are interested, you'll see the technical codes there on the screen if you're interested in diving deeper into how they were formulated. And the goal here is to understand how does the system respond under some kind of plausible climate extremes. And here are the results. So again, we have our scenarios on the top row, and then our performance measures on the left column. Across both the wet and the dry futures, we see general increases in water system stress compared to our current baseline. So that includes more days with assimilative capacity challenges, increased potential water shortages, more days with higher water temperatures, and a higher percentage of low flows in those low flow days, pardon me, in those tributaries. Interestingly, there's not a huge difference between the wet and dry scenarios in overall trends. And that really, I mean, it kind of surprised me. That might seem surprising to you. We might expect that the wet scenario could reduce something like potential water shortages, but it doesn't really necessarily work that way because timing and location matter just as much as the total volume. If precipitation comes all at once or in the wrong place, it can move quickly through the system without being available when and where it's needed. So even in a wetter future, we can still experience periods of water stress. Things become more concerning when we start to layer in those pressures, extra pressures. um, So here, what I've got is the baseline. I've dropped in the dry future, pulling back from the increased water demand with that full allocation scenario. And then over here on the right, we've got what happens when you combine the two, dry future as well as full allocation. And really what we see is a compounding of the issue, some increases in the potential water shortages and assimilative capacity, as well as those issues with specifically vermilion low flows. So in summary, what we can anticipate is that future dry conditions could strain our water supply, especially with increased demand. Arid tributaries like the Vermilion and Sturgeon are at a higher risk of impact from climate pressures. And finally, the model also highlighted some specific moments of risk which came out of this. For example, in one scenario, a significant drought occurred around 2069 and resulted in the Bighorn Reservoir approaching critically low levels following a year of weak inflows. So this isn't a prediction exactly of what will happen, but it is a useful illustration of how multi-year drought conditions could strain even our largest storage systems in the province. So in response to these climate-related challenges, the working group identified a set of adaptive strategies focused on strengthening the system's resilience over time. And these included we're going to see a repeat in those first two strategies that to establish an approved water management plan to ensure that we don't overallocate the system, and improve water security for Indigenous communities, reflecting that key priority, both of these reflecting a key priority that communities have to have reliable, safe, equitable access to water, particularly as climate change increases. But then we also have some new strategies. And in here, we talked about developing a natural asset program and tools to support ecosystem services and fill in key information gaps. And related to this is implementing the NSWA's wetland strategy. So natural assets like wetlands and forests and riparian areas play a critical role in storing water, slowing runoff, and maintaining base flows, which improve resilience to both floods and droughts and can avoid expensive costs to local infrastructure. Natural assets are especially important for sustaining good flow in tributaries. So advancing these strategies is key for our key actions for climate adaptations across the basin. So jumping into the third of the four scenarios that I'm going to talk about, I promise I won't go through every scenario that was tested because that would take all day. So we're going to talk about the minimum flow target. This means that ensuring, what is a minimum flow target? It means ensuring that baseline amounts of water remain in the river at all times to support ecosystem health and overall system function. And ideally, these targets would be based on a detailed in-stream flow needs assessment. But as mentioned before, that work hasn't been completed yet for this river. And so the project team established what we call proxy targets or educated guesses based on their expertise. The two targets that they set were 135 meters cubed per second in the summer, so a bit higher, and then a wee bit lower in the wintertime. And these flows represent roughly the lowest 10% of historical flows since the dams have been built. So they're not perfect targets. We really need the IFN study to kind of confirm the validity, but they do give us a practical benchmark to test how the system might respond. When we apply these minimum flow targets under current conditions, we see an immediate improvement in assimilative capacity. And in simple terms, this just means that there's more water in the river to dilute treated wastewater, which supports water quality and aquatic ecosystem health. So this is a really good example of how management decisions can directly improve performance, system performance without a whole lot of trade-offs. That's looking at the short term. Projecting a little bit into the long term changes things. When we combine, especially when we combine it with some other scenarios, we begin to see trade-offs emerge. What we have here on the top is our baseline scenario, dry future compared to dry future with extra allocations, and then increased growth demand, as well as the new flow target. So this is where we would see some of these, this is where the flow target exists. Adding minimum flow target does improve assimilative capacity. However, it also leads to a slight increase in potential water shortages for users, jumping from 2000 to 21. So looking ahead, we'll need to actively navigate these trade-offs. And stepping back, what did we learn from this? Minimum flow targets clearly improve water quality and ecosystem conditions. Under current climate conditions, there are minimal trade-offs. But under future dry scenarios, those trade-offs become much more significant. We may face situations where we can't meet both the ecological needs and water demand simultaneously. So this is especially pronounced during severe drought conditions. Just want to emphasize that. And importantly, these targets are based on proxies. So a formal in-stream flow needs assessment is a critical next step to ensuring that we are setting the right targets for this river. And that work of completing an in-stream flow needs assessment is identified within the roadmap strategies. It's a foundational step towards establishing an approved water management plan for the basin. And another strategy is creating an Indigenous guided future roadmap to ensure that Indigenous water priorities are meaningfully included and advanced. Okay, so the last scenario that I'm going to look at today is to illustrate how the dam operations could be used as a water availability tool. The working group explored two potential strategies here. Early refill, so this involves capturing earlier snow melt, which is expected under climate change. I would say that this approach isn't really new. Reservoirs, they do this, and dam operators, they already do this kind of adjusting seasonally, but it was included to demonstrate how the timing adjustments could influence outcomes. What is new is this increased storage capacity, and this scenario that we looked at was increasing the reservoir storage by 15%. This would represent a major infrastructure undertaking requiring significant investment and consultation. It is not a recommendation, but rather a way for us to explore what additional storage could mean for the system. And for the sake of interest in saving time here, I'm not going to go through the modeling results, but I'll just share the summary here. Early refill results in modest improvements, including fewer days with assimilative capacity issues. It reduced loading pressure, and we saw a slight reduction in water shortages. And increasing storage provided some benefits, particularly under extreme low flow conditions, where we saw minor improvements in low flow days in the main stem. But what was really important to note here is that what the model shows is that in a severe drought, none of these strategies are fully going to prevent reservoir depletion. So we need to be realistic about what the limits are in the system and what infrastructure and operations can actually achieve. And so with this one, there's just the one strategy associated with this, which is to connect these modeling, which is actually to explore the possibility of establishing a collaborative relationship with hydro facilities in support of a shared understanding. So as climate change alters flow regimes and intensifies drought conditions, understanding and managing the relationships between hydroelectric operations and river flows will become increasingly important. This goal is about improving transparency and shared understanding of operational constraints and opportunities, and supporting more predictable and optimized water flows to meet ecological, municipal, and agricultural and industrial needs. The objective is not meant to override the mandates of hydroelectric facilities, but about working collaboratively to find operational alignments that benefit the whole basin, the water security of the whole basin. And again, in the interest of time, I can't go through the full suite of modeling results, such as the off-stream storage scenarios or the forest fire scenario, but I do encourage you to explore those in the full report. What I will highlight are the remaining three strategic priorities identified in the roadmap. So they are to improve water quality in key drinking water sources, including lakes and tributaries, strengthening alignment with Alberta's land use framework and other existing regulatory processes, and advancing aquifer management planning informed by Alberta Energy Regulator and the Government of Alberta. So each of these priorities is supported, again, by a detailed set of actions in the roadmap. So, summary of key model findings. The main stem of the North Saskatchewan River, it has enough water to support some population and industrial growth. However, water shortages will increase with growing water demand, especially if license holders fully utilize their full allocation. This assessment is based on current data and should be revisited once in-stream flow needs assessment has been determined. Water availability in the main stem appears to be secure in relation to climate pressures. However, we should be prepared for an extreme drought scenario where reservoirs may empty. New dams or large storage projects are not expected to be needed at this time, though the working group wanted to note that further study is required to really confirm this. Arid tributaries, such as the Sturgeon and Vermilion rivers, are at risk of impact from climate pressures, and they really cannot sustain economic and population growth demands. And finally, the management of existing reservoirs has a really large impact on water availability of the river. So that was a key finding from this modeling work. So if we step back and look at the big picture, there's cautious optimism in these findings. The main stem is holding strong. We're not at a point where we need major new infrastructure, but there are some important caveats to that. And perhaps importantly, we wanted to note that the risks are not evenly distributed across our watershed. Tributaries are where we see real vulnerability emerging, and that's where impacts will likely be felt first. The confidence in this project is based on what we know today, and there's still some key gaps like completing an in-stream flow needs assessment. And the key takeaway for this whole project isn't that everything is just fine. It's that we have some time to act before pressures become much harder to manage. So what this roadmap ultimately shows us is that we're not really facing a single challenge. We're facing a combination of pressures that include climate change, growth, and competing demands. And while the system is resilient, it is not limitless. The good news is that we have some options. We have some clear practical strategies that can improve outcomes. And those strategies, and we want to just say that those strategies, they only really matter when they're put into action. And this really is a shared responsibility across governments, industry, municipalities, Indigenous communities, and all water users. So the future of this river system will be shaped not just by the conditions that we face, but by the decisions that we make together. And the roadmap is an invitation for us all to be part of that. So yes, that's what the roadmap project was all about. I do want to take a minute here to say thank you to our 11 project funders that ranged from federal sponsorship to provincial, municipal, and industrial sponsors as well. And yeah, thank you to you as well for your attention and your interest in this project. And I'd be happy to take any questions at this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary Ellen. It's a fantastic presentation. Really interesting to see all of those modeling results of the different scenarios compared to each other. That is just, yeah, it's a lot of information for sure. So I did post in the chat the link to our webpage on this project. So if you are interested in kind of digging into the results more, taking a look further at that infographic or the report, you can follow that link to see the project page on our website. So we do have a couple questions in the chat here.
Okay.
So the first one that came in is we hear that AI usage in data centers are heavy water users. Are there concerns about a rapid increase in industrial allocations due to the drive for data centers? Where does this sit in relation to other industrial users?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I kind of anticipated I was going to get the AI question. So I'll start by saying this project generically looked at increased water use across all industries. Like it didn't get very specific about data centers and their water use. I do think that there is possible use of this model to evaluate the effect on data centers, but we need to know much more about how much water data centers are actually using, and I've found that it's difficult to get those numbers. And I will say that if we wanted to go there, what we would need to know is how many data centers are in our basin, like being proposed for our basin, the volumes of water that they're proposing to use, as well as any kind of associated water usage that might come with electricity needs that they require. So, you know, the second part of that question was about industrial use and comparing. It is difficult to kind of compare water use without knowing how much water the data centers are actually needing. I did some digging on this a little bit, and I did see some numbers that ranged from 3,600 cubic meters a day to 24, I think it was 24 million cubic meters a year. That's an enormous range. But taking the outer limit of that 24 million, it's still in comparison, it roughly represents about less than 10% of our largest water user in in the industrial water category. So I mean, it's a matter of like maybe it's okay if one data center wants to use that quantity of water, but what happens when we see 100 data centers wanting that kind of quantity of water? And so what I would really like to emphasize is the need to ensure that we have a water management plan in place to prevent any kind of over allocation, now before we could see that runaway effect.
Yeah, for sure. Planning for a proactive approach instead of a reactive approach would probably be
Absolutely.
key there. Great. So the next question is, I believe just related to some of the categories of results. What condition defines a water shortage relative to projected demands?
What? Can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, what condition would define a water shortage relative to the projected demands? So I believe the question is just asking in terms of the results showing days of water shortage potentially projected, what sort of would define that day being a water shortage day versus a regular day?
Yeah.
But
Oh,
Gordon, if you would like to use your mic to clarify too, if I got it wrong there, please go ahead.
I I think I understand. So the water shortage is about like collectively all those with water allocations. If there were any in the system that where we couldn't meet a particular volume, if you put all of those water demands together, is there a proportion of those demands that cannot be met over the course of a year? So it's actually a volumetric it's measured in cubic dams, I think, per year, and that could occur anywhere in the basin. So um, it's not just happening on the main stem. It's a question of like, are those water shortages also happening in the tributaries as well? So I hope
Right.
I answered that one.
Okay, so kind of more about the demand related to like allocation and
Yeah,
license holders.
yeah,
Gotcha.
absolutely.
Okay, maybe we have time for well, maybe we'll have to wrap it up here. There's a couple more questions in the chat, but we might have to just call it a day there. Thank you so much, Mary Ellen, for
Oh,
answering
yeah.
the questions.
Okay.
Um, and I will just wrap up with a couple notes related to our session today. So we'll pull this up. Awesome. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, the webinar is recorded, so it will be posted on our YouTube channel shortly. We'll include a link to that on our website and in our upcoming newsletter as well. So, if you guys have any questions about this webinar, you can also feel free to reach out to us anytime through email at water@nswa.ab.ca. And you can stay in touch with us via social media as well and by signing up to our monthly newsletter on our website. So you'll see kind of all the goings on of NSWA, and we'll send that directly to your inbox once a month. So as we also mentioned, this is actually our final webinar of the 2026 spring series. So we hope you enjoyed the webinars, you learned something new, and we will see you in the fall for more. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Amanda.